Good evening. It's Friday, May 15th, 2020, and it is 6 p.m. in the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., and you are tuned to the Critical Hour here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist, Dr. Wilmer Leon, and for the next hour, we will explore and analyze the salient news stories that are impacting the global village in which we live. As states are opening this weekend and in weeks to come, here is the current coronavirus count for the United States. We have 1.45 million cases confirmed. That's up by 26,768 from yesterday. We have 253,000 people recovered, and unfortunately, 86,607 people have passed in this country. That's up by 1,858 from yesterday. It's Friday, so we'll kick off today's show the way we do every Friday with my first guest. He's a frequent collaborator with all major news outlets. He's the author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. He is Caleb Maupin. Caleb, as always, welcome back.
Glad to be here, as always.
So we find ourselves now being bombarded by this anti-China narrative from a number of different angles, whether it's COVID-19, the Chinese flu, the implementation of 5G, the Belt and Road Initiative, their currency manipulators, the trade imbalance. There are just a plethora of angles that we're being hit with this anti-China rhetoric. On the Fox Business Network, the president threw out this idea that the U.S. could, quote, cut off the whole relationship, end quote, with China in the aftermath of this pandemic, in reference to discussions over these lingering trade differences between the U.S. and China. You study this quite deeply. Where do you see us being with China right now? Is this the beginning of a new Cold War, or is this really just a whole lot of jingoistic and over-the-top rhetoric from President Trump and his cronies, and many Democrats as well?
Well, I think this is a moment where it seems like U.S. policy toward China is shifting. It seems like the focus on China as an enemy is becoming the bipartisan policy. It seems like Democrats used to be more concerned about Russia, whereas Republicans were concerned about China. But if you go back to 1978, 79, when Deng Xiaoping came to the United States, when Jimmy Carter opened up relations with China, there were some elements that were very, very opposed to doing that in both the Democratic and Republican parties. But they were largely pushed aside because there was a feeling that China was a poor country, that China is not aligned with the Soviet Union. It's not really, sincere in its beliefs about communism. They just need foreign investment. So we can make a deal with them. They're not really a threat, and they might be a useful ally against the Russians. They were working with the United States in Afghanistan, for example. And it seems like after decades and decades, that has changed. Now China is a force to be reckoned with. China is a global economic power, the second largest economy in the world, the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. It has some of the biggest companies, the biggest manufacturing. It is a force to be reckoned with. And let's remember that they got hit with COVID-19 first, before anybody, right? Before anybody had been hit with it, they were hit with it. So they should have been, the least prepared. They should have been the most devastated by this pandemic. They had no time to prepare. They had no idea what it even was. They were scrambling, and they should have been the most devastated by it. But it seems like they're the least devastated by it, while the rest of the world is still struggling. While, Germany and South Korea have been forced to shut down once again after having opened up. We're at the point where China is speeding ahead, and China is coming out of this pandemic stronger than it was to begin with, almost. Its position internationally in terms of the global market is rising. And it seems like it is now becoming the bipartisan consensus that China should not be treated as a a potential place to make some money from investment. It shouldn't be treated as kind of a captive market we could borrow money from, but it should be treated as a rival geopolitically and nothing else. And it seems like that is now becoming the bipartisan consensus in both parties, and we are seeing a shift. Now, where does that leave Russia, right? Russia is very friendly to China, does business with China, is very, very economically tied in, is the main supplier of China's energy in terms of natural gas and oil. So a lot of questions are going to be raised. Italy, Spain, France, Germany, those countries have gotten closer to China in the age of Trump. They have signed on with the Belt and Road Initiative, and it seems like Europe is far more friendly to China than the United States and Britain are. So we're seeing kind of a realignment geopolitically, with China kind of becoming the primary rival of the United States, with Europe kind of caught in the middle, and the United States just beating a drum of hatred for China, with the rest of NATO kind of looking on and not really willing to jump on board with that.
But how much sense does all of this U.S. rhetoric really make? With everything that you've just laid out, and as accurate as you are, is most of this really just for U.S. public consumption? The analogy I would use here, this is like my thinking I can beat Michael Jordan 2 out of 3 in a game of 21. It's not going to happen. And I got a pretty good jumper, but it's not going to happen. So again, is this all this expression about U.S. policy and all of this saber rattling and all of this stuff? I don't really see any there.
Well, I hope you're right. I really hope these are empty threats. I hope it is simply a method of distracting the U.S. public.
Wait a minute. Hang on a second. But not so much. How can I express it? What in the world can we do? I mean, because whether it's supply chain, whether it's technology, whether it's militarily, we do not want to go toe to toe with these folks. Again, I don't want to step in the ring with Mike Tyson. So what can we do? Does that make sense? I mean, what's our win here?
Well, unfortunately, though, I mean, there are a number of things the U.S. could do. Probably the biggest vulnerability that China has is the South China Sea, because right. China depends on oil imports. They get oil in pipelines and natural gas in pipelines from Russia, but most of their oil is delivered on oil tankers via the South China Sea, and that's why China has increased its military presence in the South China Sea to secure those oil imports, so that they
to that point, I'm sorry to jump in on you like this, but
sure.
To that point, do we want to get into a fight with China in the South China Sea? No.
I would think we wouldn't. It seems to not be in the interest of the country. But I wouldn't put it past our leaders. Unfortunately, though, our leaders in this country, when they are determined to go to war, when they are determined to isolate a country, things happen that are not really in the interest of humanity overall, not in the interest of most of the population of this country, certainly not in the interest of the country being attacked. But they will do things that they think are in their geopolitical interest long term.
So does somebody need to tell Pompeo, Biden, and Trump, China ain't Venezuela, and you don't want to mess with Venezuela? I mean, does somebody need to say, hello, guys, wake up here. You're picking the fight with the wrong people.
Well, indeed. And on some level, this propaganda campaign against China is essentially just an effort to distract from the massive failures over here. It's an attempt to point the finger and to distract from their successes in dealing with the pandemic. It's an attempt to, instead of pointing out that they dealt with it so effectively, point out that they're to blame for it. We should hate them. It's an attempt to redirect the conversation largely. I hope that's all it is, for the sake of humanity.
Okay, dig it. Because again, that's a fight. That's a fight. I don't know if you saw the most recent footage of Mike Tyson, but even today, that's a guy you don't want to fight with in a phone booth. U.S. blocks UN global ceasefire resolution, objecting to indirect reference to the WHO. This once again, for 6 weeks, the U.S. delegation to the UN Security Council has objected to references to the World Health Organization within this resolution. So you've got the UN trying to calm the world and bring some type of ceasefire to a number of these conflicts, and the United States won't sign on because the United States doesn't like the way that the WHO is being referenced in the resolution?
Well, it's weird. In U.S. politics, you've had a far right, not your mainstream neocon Republicans, but a far right that is obsessed with the United Nations. The John Birch Society used to have posters, "Get us out of the UN and the UN out of us." And, there's been kind of what you can call an anti-globalist, nationalistic, paleo-conservative edge in U.S. politics for a long time. And I think after the failure of the Bush administration, those elements kind of got the upper hand in the Republican Party. With the rise of Sarah Palin was kind of a pivotal moment. And then, the Tea Party, and now, what we're seeing with Trump is that element that has been kind of beating that drum for a long time, that is calling for more tariffs, that is, believes that the UN is violating the sovereignty of the United States, that entities like the World Bank and the World Health Organization are somehow infringing on America's sovereignty and making us part of globalism or communism or something like that. That those elements now have a much stronger footing within the Republican Party. And Trump really will take any opportunity to symbolically throw them a bone. So calling out the World Health Organization, having the USA withdraw from the UN Human Rights Council, anything he can do that kind of makes those elements feel like they've been heard, he'll do. He won't really help them out in terms of solid material stuff. He's not withdrawing the USA from NATO. He's having the USA, just as active in the UN as it was before, maybe not paying as much money. But in terms of actual solid changes, those folks really aren't getting what they want. But Trump loves to gesture and give those folks the feeling that they have been heard. And he's using this pandemic as an opportunity to rage against the World Health Organization, to rage against the globalists, et cetera. I mean, this is about beating the drum of paleoconservatism. And it mirrors the fact that the Democratic Party, in a lot of ways, the rhetoric has become much more social democratic or democratic socialist. But in terms of actual policy changes, it's stayed about the same. It mirrors that, right? Both parties are becoming more radical in words, but staying about the same in deeds.
And while all this is going on, American weapons manufacturers are thriving, even as the U.S. economy suffers. And this is something that should be getting an awful lot more of attention, especially from people such as, what's her name on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow and that crew. But this kind of fits right into their game plan.
Indeed it does. And the gap between the two parties in terms of rhetoric is growing, and even in terms of policy, there are some clear differences. But it seems like this anti-China move, this anti-China pivot, is bipartisan. It seems like there may be differences in how it's carried out, but it seems like this is the new foreign policy consensus. We don't like China in the United States. That's unfortunate, but that's where things are going.
But with all of this money going into the military, with Donald Trump rebuilding the military as he claims, are these defense contractors ramping up for a war that they know about, but that we don't see on the horizon? Or is it just they're taking advantage of the bank vault being open and no one minding the store? And please forgive those mixed metaphors.
Well, I think that what we're probably going to see is an escalation of sales of U.S. weapons throughout Asia. And I think that U.S.-aligned forces will be pressured to buy a lot more weapons. Taiwan has purchased a huge amount of U.S. military hardware. And we know that in Taiwan, there are forces that do not recognize Taiwan as being part of China, even though the U.S. officially does. But those forces, continue to gain popularity in the country and rise in Taiwan's politics. Taiwan is buying more military hardware. I can see that, there are probably U.S.-aligned countries around that region that are going to be buying more military hardware. There will probably be an increased U.S. military presence in the Pacific. And Obama did that with his Asian pivot as well. But what's interesting is we have the rise of governments in that region that used to be solidly in the camp of the United States that are now a little more neutral. Duterte in the Philippines, now, he goes back and forth, but I don't think Trump can count on him to join some crusade against China.
Mm-hmm.
The same for Moon Jae-in in South Korea. For a long time, South Korea was considered a U.S. puppet country. Not so much anymore. South Korea is quite critical of the United States. And so, we've seen the rise in governments in the region that are neutral, maybe more sympathetic to China, but I expect that the U.S.-aligned governments in that region will be arming themselves and amping up their militarism. I expect more U.S. forces will pour into the region to try and put pressure on China. I expect that the USA will try to exacerbate divisions between China and Vietnam. It's a relationship that has a history of problems. We know about the invasion of Vietnam by China in 1978, and there's disputed islands, and I expect the United States will be courting Vietnam as an anti-China ally much stronger than it once did. So I expect there will be an escalation now that this seems to be more the bipartisan focus.
And it's interesting that Donald Trump ran on a platform of getting the United States out of these senseless wars, which I haven't really seen materialize, but at the same time, motivating and encouraging all of these countries to buy more weapons. All that really seems to be doing is sowing the seeds for more conflict.
Indeed, but it's the industry. It's where our money comes from. The USA is the world's largest arms exporter. It's a huge part of American manufacturing. So, that's, war creates jobs, war creates money for Wall Street. And you look at all the top Wall Street companies, they've all got Pentagon contracts. This is the American way.
As we get out, and thank you so much for your time, what's Caleb Maupin looking at for next week?
Well, I'm keeping my eye on international situations and the global economy. I'm looking at that oil price and just kind of blown away by what's going on. I'm also wondering about these countries that have shut down once again after opening up. And I'm curious. It seems to me like we in the United States are on the verge of opening up in many, many places, not necessarily because that's what's best, health-wise, but simply because our economy is organized in a way that we can't shut down effectively. And that should be very, very concerning. And I worry about the future. We see the anti-lockdown protests, but we also see just kind of the economy, creaking and moaning. And it looks like we're going to be opening up, even though the health advice is saying otherwise.
And to that point, I'm already seeing data that a couple of the states that opened up last week are already seeing spikes in new COVID-19 cases.
Not surprising at all.
Caleb Maupin, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciated as always. You are so gracious when we call. Stay safe, stay healthy, and look forward to talking with you next week.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure, and thank you.
My man. All right, folks. You're listening to The Critical Hour here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Dr. Wilmer Leon. There is more on the other side. Stay tuned.